Right guys, welcome to this video on positive risk-taking activities. In this video we're going to talk about why it's important to take some risks in our play and in our games and what the benefit is for us. Let's get started. So why is it important that we as human beings take some risks when we play and when we're involved in sport and activity? Why should we take risks? Well, the first and very important point to begin with is that it's important for child development. Now, kids need to be given the opportunity to push the boundaries of their physical competence. They need to be given the opportunity to see what they can do and also to see what they can't do. So it's important as adults to give kids an opportunity to have a go at new skills, to have a go at new activities, to take risks. Kids, generally speaking, want to take risks, and it's important that the adults allow kids to take risks so that they can figure out what's too dangerous, and they can figure out what's a step too far for them. Without always cocooning them and keeping them wrapped in bubble wrap so they can't experience the world. So we need to ask ourselves, as far as child development is concerned, we need to ask ourselves, how likely is it that this activity will lead to someone getting hurt? If the seriousness of the possible injuries is quite low, then why not give it a go? If we're talking about sort of minor cuts and bruises and grazes and things like that, then the benefits of taking that risk and pressing against kind of the limits of that kid's physical competence is going to benefit that child enormously in terms of their self-esteem, their physical capacity, and there's loads of benefits which we'll talk about in a moment as to why kids should be encouraged to take risks. So we should always make time for this kind of physical play. Maybe it's rough and tumble, maybe it's things like skateboarding and so on. Give kids the opportunity to see what they can do. It's really important for their own psychological and physiological development. And so we're not just talking about kids, of course, we're also talking about adults, about all humans. Positive risk taking is really important for all human flourishing. It's not just about kids, it's adults as well. We need to test ourselves. We enjoy it. It's fun, it's enjoyable to test the limits of your capacity, to try something new, to have a go at a new task, to have a go at a new skill, to have a go at a new sport. It's so important. It keeps our brains ticking over. It keeps us engaged with real life. It keeps us engaged with our own bodies. They're really important things to be engaged with, is taking risks in terms of our play, in terms of our sport. And one of the most important things that it teaches us is, of course, to cope with success and failure and to know where our limits are, to know what we're likely to be successful at and what we're likely to fail at. If you've never tested your physical capacity, you won't know what kinds of skills and abilities that you or activities that you might fail at or might succeed at. And so risk taking, managed, careful, thoughtful risk taking can help us cope with our successes and enjoy them, and also cope with our failures and make sense of them. So what kinds of activities are we talking about? Well, essentially the best kinds of risk-taking activities are those that can be managed effectively but do genuinely offer some degree of risk. So it's those sorts of activities that provide excitement and that we can have a go at again and again, and adrenaline maybe kicks in and we get excited by the prospect of playing or doing that skill or performing or landing that jump or whatever it might be. So we're talking about things like, in terms of what kinds of activities we mean when we're talking about positive risk-taking activities, essentially the best kind of things, really, there are other things, but essentially we're talking about outdoor activities, adventurous activities. So things like bike riding, skateboarding, parkour, hiking, jumping off stuff, to simplify things, that sort of thing, where there is risk there's potential for some danger, but that's part of what makes taking that risk exciting. It's part of what helps us learn what our capacities are. So outdoor and adventurous activities are really useful for this kind of risk-taking activity. And then the important thing to remember is obviously the risk has to be managed in some way. We need to think about a few things in particular. We need to think about how we're going to prevent harm coming to ourselves or those that we're asking to take risks in their play. How do we make sure that they're not going to come to harm? And if there is some harm that's possible, making sure that it's minimized or eliminated or as close to eliminated as possible. It's very rare, of course, that you can completely eliminate risk. It's basically impossible. So how do we minimize it to the best of our ability and still retain the genuine nature of the risk-taking activity? So we need to manage the risk in terms of being aware of how we might prevent harm. We also need to think about what the sensible boundaries for the task or the skill are. So we're not asking, if you're a coach, for example, you're not asking young players or young people to take risks that are beyond the boundaries of their capacity. So we need to push against those boundaries, but we need to be wise in not trying something that's way, way, way outside of our competence. And another thing, a fairly straightforward thing to think about is if we are going to manage risk, it does make sense to have some kind of risk assessment. Now, it could be a formal risk assessment, and obviously there are legal requirements in certain situations to have a formal risk assessment for this sort of thing, but it doesn't necessarily just mean that. A risk assessment can also be if you're playing, you're out and about and you're playing, you decide to run and do some jumping and so on. It's just to quickly check around you, make sure that the scene is clear, make sure that where you're going to be jumping from and to is secure and safe and so on. So it doesn't have to be, when we say risk assessment, it doesn't have to be a written formal document, although sometimes that's legally required. If you're just out playing with friends, or just mucking about in the park or whatever it is, it's still a good idea to have a little bit of a think about where the potential hazards are and what you're going to do to avoid them. So positive risks are really important. We should take risks in our physical activity for our own well-being, for our own welfare, for our own flourishing. Things like outdoor activities, adventurous activities, but we should always be wise in the way that we do it. So why do these things? What are the benefits? The benefits of positive risk taking are both physiological, that is to do with the body, and also psychological, that's to do with the mind. And obviously those two things are linked together. And one really good example of some of the benefits of doing some of those activities we've talked about, where there's an element of risk that has to be overcome, we push our boundaries against that risk. One of the key benefits is endorphin release. So endorphins are chemicals released in the brain that inhibit the sense of pain that we might experience and increase the sense of pleasure. And so when we do pleasurable things, when we engage in pleasurable activities, enjoyable and exciting activities, endorphins are released and they have a number of impacts. So as I've mentioned, it produces a sense of pleasure, psychological well-being. It also, this release of endorphins has a knock-on impact to other parts of our life, so it may help us ultimately boost our self-esteem. It may help us to reduce our stress, and it may also help us to combat some forms of depression. This is one of the reasons why we often hear about how physical activity is prescribed for people who are struggling with depression. It doesn't cure them of their depression, but sometimes it can help alleviate some of the symptoms. And this idea of risk taking, of pressing against the boundaries of your physical competence, gives you this boost of endorphins, this release of endorphins, and has multiple impacts, both physiologically in the way that you feel in your body, and psychologically in the way that you think and feel in your mind. So we've got all these combined benefits. And if I'm going to summarize the idea of the benefits of positive risk taking, when we weigh up the benefits, we weigh up the problems, and we go for it and we succeed, I'm going to sum it up in this phrase, that success breeds confidence, and confidence then breeds success. So as we find ourselves competent in physical activity, we try something new, perhaps something we've previously not been able to achieve, and we try it again and we succeed and so on, that builds, or that breeds, a sense of confidence in what we're able to do. And then that confidence, because it has such a psychologically positive impact, that confidence then enables us to go on and push against those boundaries further and be increasingly successful in the physical attributes and the physical capacities that we develop as individuals. And that's part of what we were talking about just now, about human flourishing. We need to press against our limits. We need to enjoy some success in our physical movements, in our physical skills, and adapting and adopting new skills. And the benefits that we get from this positive risk-taking activity breeds confidence when we're successful, and then that confidence breeds success in turn. And we have all these positive impacts both in the brain and in the body, and in the ways that those two things interact with one another. So positive risk-taking activities, hugely important, especially for child development, but also for human flourishing generally. I hope that video has been useful and interesting to you. If you've got any further questions, please leave them in the comments below the video. Anything else you want me to cover, please let me know. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care for now.